Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final session of day one of the MaaS Scotland annual conference, and welcome to the second of our technical sessions exploring the very important and I think oft overlooked area of user engagement and its relation to mobility as a service. Just before I pass you on to our session chair, Jenny, I just wanted to encourage you to engage with this session through the chat and Q&A functionality available to you. Remember also that you can keep discussions going through our Slack platform, details of which should be in the chat now. So I'd like to introduce you to our session chair, Jenny Milne, who is owner at JLM and part-time PhD student in the area of rural MaaS. Jenny is a good friend of MaaS Scotland and is absolutely my go-to person when I have any questions on the subject of rural MaaS or indeed rural mobility more broadly. She's also a strong proponent of user engagement as a key consideration when developing mobility solutions. So Jenny, welcome, and the session is now yours.
Thank you, Ali. He always usually refers to me as the rural guru, and looking at the participant list, there's probably only a handful of you that haven't met me before, but just to give you a bit of context of who I am, yes, I live rurally, I breathe rural. I've been in intelligent transport systems for several decades now, so I hate to say that. But I'm also the founder of the Scottish Rural Island Transport Community, SRITC, which I know Ali will talk about later on. That focuses obviously, as it says on the tin, on rural and transport and islands. And I have to say, lockdown has been fantastic for, I think, MaaS in general and for rural transport as well. And in turn, users. Because people are able to engage very easily. You don't need to travel long distances. Ali's kindly put in the chat the convention that we've got next week, and we have a session with rural mobility as a service. We've got Australia, Japan, America, Scotland all joining live in. So please come and join us on that one. And it's important, really important to have users involved in whatever you do within transport. And we're really lucky to have three great speakers with us this afternoon. I've told them to keep it short, sharp and punchy so that we can keep going, because some of us have probably got a bit of PowerPoint fatigue. But we'll be kicking off with Louise in a minute. But I have to say it's great that we've actually got a female balance here, Ali. There's been a bit of a male balance before Carla came in. So nice to get a female balance. And some might say Glenn's sandwiched between two women here, but hey ho, hope that's got you smiling. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Louise to upload her slides. And we will focus on the user for the next 45 minutes to an hour. So sit back and enjoy. Louise, can I have your slides, please? I think you might need to unmute, Louise. Are you there? Because you were there before we opened up the door to the chat and to the session. Louise, can somebody put something in the chat for me to say if it's just me?
I'm here.
Me?
I'm here.
Yep, fab. Thank you.
Okay.
Over to you. All
right. Thank you, Jenny. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm head of insight at Transport Focus, and I'm going to whiz through a few relevant thoughts really about the kinds of issues that we talk about. So for those of you who don't know who we are, Transport Focus are the independent transport user watchdog or representative, and basically our mission is to be evidence-based and to be useful, and we find out what users think and non-users, and we publish it and aim to make a difference for all transport users. And what I'm going to do today is share some of what we know from different sources of information that I think are quite useful in thinking about how people feel about transport right now and how that could then develop into using mobility as a service. So I'm going to start off with a few kind of positive thoughts. or thoughts that could be seen positively. And firstly, this is just a couple of screenshots from our data hub, which is where all our data is publicly available for analysis. And it shows satisfaction at the journey level with rail journeys across Great Britain. And this is from spring 2020, so pre-COVID. And we can see that overall journey satisfaction is at 82%. So that's pretty high. There's clearly room for improvement, but broadly journeys are satisfactory. And then of course below that you can see there's slightly lower satisfaction with some other measures around sort of punctuality. Value for money is always an area where we see lower satisfaction, but cleanliness of the train, level of crowding, around 3/4 were satisfied with an individual journey. Moving on to look at buses, broadly the same kind of information. Bus passenger satisfaction is slightly higher at 89% journey satisfaction, and the other measures being broadly more positive and value for money there higher than on rail. So broadly, journeys are pretty good for users. We also though ask about trust in the operators who provide the transport, and we can see here it's a bit of a broader measure, and we do see lower kind of levels of agreement that they trust their transport operator, which I think is something to think about. So while an operator may be trusted to get somebody there and make a journey safely, there is perhaps more work to be done around offering add-ons or doing more than just providing journeys or modes of transport for an individual journey. When you ask rail passengers how could trust be improved and what could be done to make the relationship better between the user and the operator, a lot of people talk about the complexity of fares and about transparency and about just understanding what they are buying, what the restrictions are, what they're entitled to, what happens if they change their plans, why couldn't they get a refund, and all of those kinds of things. So I think clarity around what am I buying, what am I getting, how does it work, am I getting the best product to suit my needs are really important for people as they make journeys. And a couple of slides here that also come from the National Rail Passenger Survey that I think illustrate the point quite nicely, that what people are doing and what they have with them when they're making journeys has changed hugely, even in the last 9 years or so. So this shows how people reported spending their time on a rail journey. So we can see that checking emails, internet browsing, accessing social media sites have really increased, as you'd expect, over 9 years, at the expense of window gazing, people watching, reading for leisure, and even eating and drinking. People don't have time for eating and drinking anymore because they're so busy sort of checking their social networking and looking at their emails. So people are generally connected when they're making journeys, and we can see here what did people when they were making a journey have with them. And I think this is quite an interesting point that illustrates how history has moved quickly. Back in 2010, there wasn't actually anything defined as a smartphone that we even asked about whether they had one there. In 2014, we had to explain what a smartphone was, but in 2019, almost 50% had a smartphone with them when they made the journey. So it's high, but I think also we do need to think there that it does also mean that around half didn't have a device that they could connect with. So this assumption that everybody always has a smartphone with them isn't necessarily true, and we mustn't forget that there are people who don't have that same level of interactivity when they're making a journey. But broadly, people are much more connected. And also broadly, we know from some work we did with people around their attitudes to buses, people are supportive of public transport. 83% agree that having a good bus network is important to a local area, and 4 in 10 agree that travelling by bus is a good way to get around. And among bus users, 25% are really quite open to making more journeys by bus. So I think that's all quite positive in terms of how people are feeling. But conversely, we do know that from some other pieces of work that we've done, that there are some key issues and barriers around travelling differently, and by implication to looking at using mobility as a service. And I'm sure these kinds of things aren't news at all, but work that we've done with passengers does reinforce these points. So we know that people are often reluctant to do anything different. They do what they do, they know what they know, and they carry on doing it. And they often also have expectations or perceptions that doing anything different will be not so good as what they're doing. There's a lot of post-justification going on there. And people broadly do like to keep doing what they're doing and don't bother to even to think about whether there are other options available. And we also know, of course, that just because something is a better value proposition doesn't necessarily mean that people will take that up, even when they know that a better value solution is available. And that's illustrated by the fact that 24% of rail users who are travelling 5 days a week still use a single or return daily ticket rather than buy a weekly product. And clearly for some of them, it's about affordability, that they can't pay up front for a weekly on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. But for many others, it is just around that reluctance to commit to buying something when they feel they may need some flexibility later in the week. All of those, what if I'm ill? What if my plans change? What if my child is poorly and I don't need to go to the office? I'll have wasted that kind of money. We did a campaign around getting people who didn't use buses to give it a go, and that reinforced what I was saying earlier on about the difference between the expectation and perception and reality, with reality when people try things generally being pleasantly surprising. And we found this across multiple pieces of work that we've done. So that kind of sets the context for MaaS, and I think my starting point here would be, before people will consider using anything that's more complicated than a pure buying a journey on a mode of transport, those individual journeys need to feel easy and connective and intuitive. But then, of course, along came COVID-19, which did really change things, and we've been looking at the effect on transport since then. So I'll just share a few headlines from that with you. We've been looking at use of public transport since early in May, so we're up to the 22nd week of measuring it, and 18% of the total GB population have used any public transport in the last 7 days, which is up from sort of 5% back at the start of when we did this. So it's going up, but it's still not widespread. And many people who used to regularly use public transport, so we have this data for both bus and train, but I'm just showing you the bus one here. So this says that of the people who used to use bus regularly, so several times a month, but haven't used it in the last 7 days, 60% almost, 6 out of 10 haven't used a bus since before restrictions were introduced. So there's a lot of people who are really out of practice at using public transport. So we'll need to be, it's almost introduced to what it is and clearly how it works now in the post-COVID world. And when you ask about their plans to return to using bus or train, for a significant proportion, they aren't able to say when they think they will next use public transport. And for relatively high proportions. It's quite a while in the future before they envisage interacting again with public transport. And when you ask people why they haven't used public transport since the COVID situation, the most common reason is that they had no reason to use. But equally, we do see significant proportions who say that they've started using other modes and they've reverted to using a car when perhaps they used to use public transport. And often they cite reasons such as just not feeling safe or deliberately avoiding public transport. That's clearly going to be a barrier in getting people back on board. So clearly that means that we need to, when we're speaking to people about what it's like, there's some new aspects really that have come into the frame of what's it like when you're using public transport, and things like cleanliness and how busy services are, and whether you're able to social distance, and compliance with face covering rules, and what other passengers are doing and how they're behaving and how safe people feel are clearly really new important elements that go into the equation. And we know, talking about the difference between experience and perceptions, when you ask people who made a journey how safe they felt when they did that, we're looking at sort of 81% saying that they felt safe when they made a journey. It fluctuates slightly from week to week, but broadly 8 out of 10 feel safe when they're making a journey by rail. But when you ask people who haven't used the mode, how safe do you think you'd feel, the figure is lower, and more than half are saying that they don't think they would feel safe making a journey. So that kind of illustrates some of the barriers that we're encountering. And people do expect to be changing their behaviour as time goes on, and we are seeing this across multiple projects that we do. People think that after COVID, they will be working from home more, they intend to be doing more active travel, perhaps even looking at more fundamental changes to their life, such as moving house, rethinking their lives more fundamentally. So there is going to be a really changing landscape in what people are doing, how they're doing it, how they feel about using the modes of transport that they did use before COVID. So I think there's an awful lot up for grabs, but one of the sort of key takeouts for us is how you get people back into doing the kinds of things that they were perfectly comfortable doing pre-COVID, as well as how you get people to perhaps think more differently, as we've all learned about doing lots of different things in life in different ways. So yeah, that's it from me. Very happy to take any questions in the panel session. So I think back to Jenny now.
Fabulous, Louise. Thank you very much. Kate Pangborn's already on the case with a question which we'll come to in the discussion panel. But I was slightly distracted at the beginning, I'm afraid. I had a 10-year-old next door having an absolute meltdown, which has not happened in the last 6 months. But it's very timely, actually, that I'm doing this now. I'm going to run a poll. And as Louise has done a fantastic scene setting, I would like you just to spend 2 seconds to answer this poll. Have you conducted any formal user engagement methods as part of previous projects related to transport? Yes or no? Quick question. I'll count down. It's like countdown with Carol Vorderman. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. You can count. And I'll let Amy then close the poll once she thinks the numbers are in. I think it's really important to make sure that we understand the audience of who's here today and who's actually done user engagement or who's actually thinking about user engagement. For those of you that don't know, you can close the poll now, Amy, if you want. I'm also doing a part-time PhD, and one of the gurus in my MaaS field is Glenn Lyons, and I'm just going to hand over to a fellow academic, but suffice to say that he tweeted earlier on that no-brainer users should be at the front and centre of MaaS. So no pressure, Glenn, but let's kick off.
Thanks, Jenny, and hello, everybody. Yes, I'm your pale male offering on the panel. I hope you won't decide I'm also stale, but it's great to be on this panel this afternoon. And I'll also ask you to judge whether you think I'm an old hand when it comes to MaaS, or a newbie who's wet behind the ears. So straight in, bringing user perspective to the evolution of MaaS. And I want to focus on that issue of evolution. So in overview, I just want to first of all make sense of what we really think we're talking about when we say mobility as a service, and underline for you that I believe it's an evolution rather than revolution in spite of the excitement recently. And then to the question which relates to some of Louise's more specific data around the COVID period, is to adopt or not to adapt when a new MaaS offer comes onto the market. And I'll give you a behavioural schema which helps perhaps illustrate the process that the end user goes through, and then finishing with future prospects and of course how to make all this happen. So I'd like to start with a couple of quotes. I'll just briefly go through these. For MaaS to become more widespread and permanent as a feature in the market, it must provide understandable and believable information, be perceived as providing a personally valuable service, and complement within day and day-to-day traveller behaviour. And it's about integration within and between different types of transport so that each contributes its full potential. I think that sounds like MaaS, but actually it doesn't. It's 20 years old and it's talking about advanced traveller information systems. I hope you can appreciate the resonance with many of the issues that endure today in what we're trying to achieve here. And further to that, we very much view MaaS as the mobility system beyond the private car. And I'm just going to build this up for you on screen. So I think the new entrant is the mobility intermediary, also known as a mobility operator, which is very much focused upon, we're told, enhancing the user experience and access to that mobility system. If we go below the waterline, there's a dependence upon there being a transaction layer, and prior to that an information services layer, and becoming more fundamental a mobility services layer, and indeed of course infrastructure and vehicles themselves. And those two provide at the bottom the physical means, and then comes the planning and execution, the procurement that we undertake as individuals of our travel, and only then really does the broker of convenience come into play. So what then from the user's perspective is travel all about? Well, Steve Stradling, a retired transport professor of psychology from Scotland, very neatly refers to the three efforts of travel: physical, cognitive, and affective. And I think for mobility as a service, it's especially important to focus on the cognitive effort, although that does lead to emotional consequences in affective terms. And we can start to think about those different layers in that mobility system beyond the private car that I showed you, as sliders, if you like, dials that we're trying to move upwards typically in terms of different forms of integration. There's operational integration, trying to minimize interchange penalties so that we get that sense of seamless experience that is so often talked about. There's informational integration so that we can offer journey planning and execution information across different modes through a single interface. And then transactional integration in a similar fashion, ticketing and payment through one interface. And depending upon the levels of those integrations, as those slide bars move, the cognitive user effort goes up or down, the effort involved in relying upon the mobility system beyond the private car to fulfill mobility goals. And we've actually set out in a paper that lies behind this presentation, the equivalent of the levels of automation that many of you will be familiar with. So here we're talking about the 5 levels, or strictly speaking 6 levels of MaaS integration, which is really depicting how different levels of achievement of operational information and transactional information have an effect on how much user effort, user cognitive effort is required. And we go from level 0, where there's really very little integration at all, where the effort is high for the user beyond the private car, down to utopia, where we've made it so integrated, seamless and convenient that the cognitive user effort is pushing towards 0. Now, a snapshot from a couple of years ago, which you're probably all familiar with, when WIM was launched in the West Midlands, just gives us a feel for the sorts of reality that are presented to a prospective user of a new offer into the mobility MaaS marketplace. So we see here, as you might be familiar with, the 3 different packages that were available from WIM at the time of the trial launch. You can see, for instance, with Pay As You Go, that we don't yet have all the modes quite ready to be on offer in the package. And if we move across the proposition of spending £350 a month to have access to everything through this intermediary, what we see is that, yes, unlimited is there apparently for public transport, taxi and car, but when you look at the detail, taxi is not quite unlimited. It's up to a certain range. Bike share is still coming soon. And by the way, it really is only a package that would appeal to car drivers. And as we know, many young people especially are yet less and less likely to hold a license. But if they do, they're weighing up, is it worth me spending £350 a month when for a similar figure I can have on a lease arrangement a brand new shiny Ford Fiesta, which is the equivalent to the car hire that was on offer at the time with that scheme. And as someone said, it's becoming increasingly difficult to make sense of the true cost of mobility as a consumer when you're looking at the different offers in the marketplace. So what happens to adopt or not to adopt when something like WIM comes into that marketplace? Well, Louise has already alluded to this, but typically behavior change comes from a change in circumstances from the user's perspective. We don't really just wake up one morning and think, today's the day I'm really going to have to think about changing my behavior. Unless something has prompted that. And the change of circumstances could be very practical. They could also be emotional, to do with our attitudes or even our values. But if we follow through into this flow chart, and it's only conceptual, you can start to see how it might play out when that new offer is brought into the marketplace. So if I zoom in a little bit further, so that change of circumstances has happened for the individual. They're now consciously considering their travel options as a result of that. Are they able to drive? Do they have access to a private car? And to what extent are they happy to maintain a dependence entirely for their mobility on that private car? Flowing down through there, it's plausible, of course, that they have no need for the mobility system beyond the private car. But if any of those are no, we move across to show some dependence on this mobility system, that pyramid that I showed earlier. We then move down to consider what happens when this new MaaS offer comes into the marketplace. Well, the first prospect is the user thinks, well, I've really no interest. I've got sufficient support from the existing MaaS offer in the marketplace beyond the private car to carry on as I am, end of story. Or I decide to explore this new option, such as the WIM offer in the West Midlands. So I've now got to decide which MaaS plan I'm going to use. And that exposes me to the modal choices I'm able to make and the experience I get from that package. I'm then asking the question to myself, is this new MaaS offer preferable to me to how I was behaving before? If it is, then yes, fantastic. We get adoption of this new offer in the marketplace. If it isn't, I may consider one of the other packages that are on offer in this new MaaS proposition, or I revert to where I was before. And for the time being, that would be end of story. If we dig a bit deeper into the very psyche of the users or prospective users we're dealing with, what I've seen over 20 or more years is that all too often in the transport sector, we are inclined to think the world is made up of Mr. Spocks, Homo economicus, very rational, I guess pale, male, stale, very rational people who are out there to be in possession of all the facts and to make a utility optimizing decision on the very best outcome in terms of their travel choices. But of course, there are many people out there, or many features in our own existences, where we're behaving more like Homer Simpson, Homo psychologicus, where frankly, we've got other things like beer, sex and donut to worry about, rather than just prioritizing the optimization of our travel. We're looking for good enough solutions. And that has implications for this prospect considering new MaaS offers. And boiling down what we understand from a long period of researching choice making and particularly the role of information, we can see in a slide I'll build up here how the demand for information relates to some key features. So first of all, the familiarity and predictability of the journeys that we're talking about. I was just revisiting the National Travel Survey for England, apologies to MaaS Scotland, and I'm reminded that 68% of journeys are under 5 miles. They're distinctly local unless they're journeys being made whilst we're on holiday. So the chances are they're quite familiar, if not predictable, in which case the demand for information is low. We then have this Spock versus Homer Simpson issue of rationality. Am I tending towards being irrational in my travel choices, or am I really unboundedly rational where I am like Mr. Spock, or somewhere in the middle? That affects our appetite for the MaaS offer. And the way we make decisions. unless it's disrupted by change of circumstances, can often be unconscious or simply confirmatory. We're not really out there looking for new travel options. And of course, formal sources of information are no longer, as they've never been, the only sources. We rely on our own past experience and instinct. We look to significant others, friends, family, and colleagues, even before we get to formal systems that are on offer. So future prospects, well, Louise has already done great justice to shining a light on the fact that what has happened during the pandemic is we've all been subjected to a change of circumstances, which has meant we've been much more consciously considering how we gain access, whether it's through the forum we're having today, digitally, or looking at new forms of mobility, revisiting the modal options that are available to us alongside perhaps changing destinations. So that prompted reconsideration of travel really is a great opportunity right now, and one that may persist for some time. Now, back to that pyramid I showed you, I'd like to reinforce that by suggesting, if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of need, here we have the hierarchy of need beyond the private car in the mobility system. The base layers, the food and shelter that are most important to people, are those bottom two, particularly mobility services. Self-actualization in the form of the mobility intermediary is a luxury we can only enjoy if we've got those base layers right. So, some concluding points to making it happen. I hope I've made clear that MaaS really isn't particularly new. It's certainly evolving, and perhaps evolving in a great space with some new opportunities, but we can learn from the past. Let's not start with a blank sheet in understanding the user. And that user-centric approach really is key. And certainly over my experience of years in this area, all too often it's paid lip service to rather than being properly addressed. And people's needs are changing, that creates opportunity. And in that context, these mobility intermediaries or operators may be able to enhance convenience and possibly price. But let's not forget, they're operating in a busy marketplace. And wherein the quality of the mobility services themselves is of central importance, again, as Louise has outlined. Well, what we've discovered in more recent work, we've been working in Aberdeen, developing a journey planner, working with Fuse Mobility and Mott MacDonald, is that there's perhaps a layer even further down in that hierarchy, which is getting policy and regulation right, because they're foundational to governing this mobility system beyond the private car. And when it comes to the real practical issues, we've just finished some work working with Transport and Main Roads in Queensland, where we've been developing an assessment framework to help assess and decide what to do, when and why, in terms of investing in improving the mobility system beyond the private car. And that's very much based upon this hierarchy of need model. And with that, Jenny, thank you very much. I'll hand back to you.
Fantastic, thank you, Glenn. I do love the fact you've got a very appropriately social distance bus behind you. I think it's great, and I'm sure everybody's always said that too. You just need to get the mask on. Anyway, before Beth quickly steps in, I'm going to ask Amy just to share the results of our poll. And I know not everybody answered the poll, but interesting to see that we have a 58% of people that have conducted user engagement. You can guess what the poll is going to be at the end of Beth's presentation. So there's no pressure on Beth here to sell it to the percentage that haven't done it before. But without further ado, I am going to pass over to Beth, who is going to sell you it.
Thanks, Jenny. Oh, pressure on me now. That's good. Well, first of all, it felt strange as I was sitting, putting together this presentation, to be thinking about how we engaged with users when I wasn't even going to be able to engage with you, the audience. So I'd like to try something. This worked really well on a webinar that I joined last week, and it's got an aim of bringing about some human connection back into this digital world. So go with me on this if you want to, but it's a really simple invitation to all of you just to simply take 3 deep breaths along with me. So for those who want to join in, here we go. First big deep breath in 2, 3, and out 2, 3. In 2, 3, out 2, 3, and in 2, 3, out 2, 3. Right, Well, hopefully we're all feeling a little bit more connected and I can get on with the presentation. So I'm hoping to shine a light on how we engage with users, but practically really focusing on how we co-design with users as we're going ahead and designing new transport services and especially new mobility as a service initiatives. So I firmly believe that service design approaches and co-design approaches enable us to design better services. Maybe not everyone's completely familiar with the phrase co-design, but at its core is the idea that users are put at the heart of the whole design process. We're looking at users as experts in their own experiences and thinking about how we harness those to design better services. There's a whole range of tools and techniques that we turn to when we're co-designing, but it's all about trying to use tools that allow us to uncover needs, really dig into those behaviours and find those nuances in behaviours. We're thinking about how we validate ideas, how we validate concepts, and then further into the project about how we're gaining buy-in and loyalty to the services that we're developing. So to start, a little introduction to a project that was about designing mobility as a service, but really tailored to the needs of people with dementia and how we designed with people with dementia. So fascinating project. And at the start of the project, we did a whole load of reading, felt we knew and understood the challenges facing people with dementia to a good level. But wow, how pleased was I as we progressed that we actually took the time to do real co-design and engagement throughout the process. Because without that, I think the service would have been so different that we designed, and nowhere near as strong a service, nowhere near as user-focused as it needed to be. But in general, we adopted fairly traditional co-design techniques, and I'll talk about 4 of those. So journey mapping is something that's used regularly in co-design. The idea that you can map out a user's experience through a service or through a change in their lives. And here we were mapping what happens when somebody has to stop driving because of a diagnosis of dementia. But you can see in the slightly wonky photo there, really simple imagery used within a workshop setting up on the whiteboard in large images that allowed for feedback from people with dementia and from their carers about what that experience was like for them. The facilitator added the notes you can see, but then also replayed those back to the participants to make sure that we'd correctly understood what was being said. So that was one simple technique. We then also used adapted the idea of personas. So personas, again, something commonly used in all sorts of areas of engagement. But in this instance, we adapted that idea slightly and turned it into a game, a simple game, again, used in a very small workshop. I think there were 2 or 3 participants at a time. And this was used to explore how people with dementia and their carers were making choices about how they travelled, what sort of challenges they faced, and in general, what would make life easier. So that was used at near the start of the project. Later in the project, we developed this prototype of the website that you can see and took that to people. So again, we were still getting feedback. By no means was this a final design. It was intended for feedback. We were looking for people to test and comment on branding, on the content of the flow of the site. And what we did here was take different devices, so people could use a device that they were most familiar with, whether it was a website or a laptop, for instance. And for those who were less comfortable with technology, we simply took them almost on a tour of the site and got their feedback that way. And from the outset, we knew that this service that we're developing, there's a lot of talk around the technology behind mobility as a service, but we knew for this group of users, there's no way that it would be successful if it was only online. So we were here almost prototyping what the in-person support might look like by running a drop-in session in East Lothian. So that was a really fun activity, but again, we were continually getting feedback on the design of the service going forward. So these are just examples from a single project, and I'm not saying they're the only tools and techniques. There's all sorts you can turn to, but in general, you can see already it's about talking, doing, and listening to people. But the current restrictions on social distancing and our requirements to stay in our homes with very few other people is certainly making this process and scenes like this from 2 other projects quite difficult, very difficult. I can't imagine quite when we're going to get back to co-designing in groups of 60 or more, as you can see in the bottom picture that was co-designing autonomous vehicles services. So we've got to think more creatively about how we continue to engage. I firmly believe that we can't let COVID stop this engagement. We need to keep co-designing. So a first port of call probably is going to be digital tools. And here are just 5. I've got to say I haven't used all of these yet, but I thought I'd throw them out there and hopefully participants might have others that they can contribute to the conversation. So we've got Miro here that advertises itself as a collaborative online whiteboard. Padlet is really interesting. That's more of a sort of mood board, but I thought that could be really good for online collaboration around ideas to let your participants add to mood boards. Trello is something that I've used previously for planning out workflow, you know, things you've got in progress and work you've done. But again, I could see how that could be used in a co-design environment. Trocida, as it says here, is about collecting ideas and voting. So voting is quite a simple way to get feedback on concepts. And then top left, Mural. Now, Steve Cassidy mentioned this earlier in his presentation about the Enable project, but I was also chatting to him about how he'd used that in the project that Glenn also just mentioned, that Fuse Mobility and Mott MacDonald were doing up in Aberdeen. So Mural's visual collaboration and all sorts of templates and things you can use within that to collaborate. I was interested to hear from Steve some of the limitations. So a bit like this engagement now, I can't quite tell who's still listening, who's looking out the window, who's on Facebook. I hope not too many people are doing that. But in general, it sounds like a really powerful tool because you can quickly set it up and get good numbers of people contributing to co-designing services. But I said we also needed to be a bit more creative, and I'm really inspired by a project that I participated in just a couple of years ago that's called ICMIST, and ICMIST is a project run by the Stockholm Environment Institute at the University of York that was looking at how creative methods could be used for inclusive, sustainable transport planning, in particular in Kenya and Uganda. And here are some photos of the methods that were used as part of that project. So what you can't see in the top left photo, purposely can't see, is a tiny little camera. So this participant here is using wearable cameras to record their experience of this space that they're in and of the public transport that was available. So we could definitely be using some of that at the moment. We can stay socially distanced and be recording user experience and use that to review back later. Top right was some participatory mapping that they took. Obviously, this isn't socially distanced, this was pre-social distance, but participatory mapping, I could see crossing over into a digital space quite easily. Bottom right, They were trying to engage a wider audience in this, so actually set up a photography tour to capture experiences in a more creative way. So this photography tour went out to get artistic photos of space, but they used that as part of the discussion going forward. And then bottom left, Minecraft. They're actually going to engage street kids within this project and talk to street kids about what the space meant to them. So I could, yeah, so a really interesting way to engage with different audiences that perhaps you wouldn't otherwise find ways to engage with easily. Just two more examples here of projects that have used technology in a slightly different way. So on the left, dementia diaries. This I came across, and I think it's fantastic in the dementia work that I mentioned earlier. So here, participants with dementia have become reporters of their own experiences, but simplified devices were given out, or they can use a landline to record their experiences as and when they want. So it might be an experience of going to the shop today, or it might be a longer diary entry about their experience of having dementia. But there's all sorts. So they record their entries, and then they're transcribed. They're made available on the Dementia Diaries website for all sorts of people to use. But what a great simple way for people to participate, to contribute their voices in projects. And then on the right, a project called Duet, which was all about text message conversations. And actually it was between participants in the UK and participants in India, and daily questions were issued to them. And pairs of people over a significant period of time then had conversations around these daily questions and these daily prompts. And ultimately it got turned into a fascinating art installation, which is what you can see here. So it was with some of those ideas in mind that when I sat down and had to design some user engagement and some co-design for a research project of my own recently, these were the first things that that started coming to mind as I sat down to do that design. I really like that simplicity of using a daily text message. So here I was I was looking at researching sustainable travel choices, particularly amongst families with young children. And I could just imagine busy parents like myself not having the time to sit down necessarily and engage at a particular time of the day. But what if in this project, I could send them a text message that they could reply to when it suited them? So I really liked that idea that you could start collecting experiences, collecting thoughts, and then as a project progressed, collecting feedback just through WhatsApp or something like that. Another thought that I had within this project was about a kit that I could design, that I could post out. So I'd think about the activities that I want people to undertake at different stages in a project, and they've got them all there in a hard copy in the kit that's come in the post, but then maybe using video conferencing as a way to get feedback and start one-on-one and group discussions around those activities. So taking some of those activities that normally would have happened in a room with Lego and Play-Doh and all sorts of other great stuff, but people doing them on their own initially and then bringing them to an online group session. So happy to discuss all of those ideas. I could keep talking forever about ideas and ways to engage, but try and bring it back to some practical considerations. So hopefully from that poll, not everybody is already using user engagement or co-design. Hopefully you're starting to think about it now. And there's really two routes you can take. You might want to learn how to do it yourself and be implementing it yourself within your projects. And there's some amazing resources online if that's the route you want to take. Some amazing courses, and start practicing it, start building it into projects. Alternatively, the route of using expertise like freelancers like myself, and we heard from Snook earlier, so there are agencies out there that you could turn to bring that into consortium. Either way, it needs resourcing. It's not a one-off activity. You've really got to be thinking about how you build in collaboration and co-design throughout the life of a project. It doesn't just start and stop. You need to be doing it throughout. So really bear that in mind, and think then about what your engagement needs to look like, how you're going to build a rapport with users, with the participants that you're working with. Do you need to do the breathing exercise that we did at the start of this presentation? I guess for me, the biggest challenge that I've found co-designing with people really is how you recruit users. It's really challenging in some contexts, particularly if you want a group of users to stay with you throughout the life of a project that might last 1 or 2 years. So that needs a lot of thought, and happy to discuss that in more detail offline. Well, just to finish then, I'm sure many of you on the presentation today are considering bids to the second round of MaaS investment funding, and I'm hoping that all of those bids are going to include user engagement and include user design. So here's just a few questions that I'd be starting with if it was me. So I'd be thinking, really, who are my users? Exactly who do I need to engage with? From there, you can then take that step of broader thinking how you engage, before then dipping into that point of what are your specific engagement and co-design techniques that you're going to be including. But for now, I'll leave it there, but happy to talk, happy to collaborate as well, so get in touch.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Beth. For those of you that were on the data session beforehand and you think that data is complex, I have to say anybody that underestimates users needs to start thinking that actually it's more complicated and they are actually part of the data story, because you need to think about the users that are out there, all the different types of users. Isn't that right, Beth? And that's what she's done. She's highlighted all the, and I don't want to use the word siloed, but all those different users that are out there. It's a very complicated web. Anyway, I'm going to ask Beth, Louise and Glenn to join me with their videos and their microphones off so we can have a bit of a free-flowing conversation. I see there's only 3 questions, so I've got lots of questions here, which I know people at the panel will be nervous about. But Louise, you've had probably a bit of time to see Kate's question that's sitting in the chat box, but she's asking, do you ask if people need to make a journey at all, not just having a reason to use public transport is the first part of it? Is that something you ask in your surveys?
Yeah, I mean, we do ask that kind of thing, and clearly in the COVID bit specifically, to start with, people were saying they didn't make any journeys because they either weren't allowed to go anywhere or they just didn't need to make journeys at all. We're also asking people about what things have they done in the last 7-day period, so we can look at that data together, and that is quite interesting. I mean, you're sort of seeing that if we're seeing in the last week 32% had been to a restaurant or cafe, 20% had been to a pub or bar, 7% had been to leisure attractions and that kind of thing. But equally, it's still around 4 out of 10 who's saying they haven't done anything. So they really kind of still have no reasons to make journeys, including going to work. So there definitely is something around not making journeys anywhere, but there is equally something else in there that we can do in the analysis that is, I had a reason to make a journey, but I deliberately chose a mode, whether that is cycling, walking or driving, when previously I would have used public transport mode. So I'd say sort of
3 of you, have you used public transport recently? Anybody put their hand up? Because I can't put my hand up. Louise has. Louise, what did you use? Bus or train?
I've used bus and train and tube very recently.
Well, anybody in the chat can say whether they've used public transport, but I actually tweeted the other day saying I don't see myself being on a train until the middle of next year. So I don't know what Beth and Glenn think about that, but that's going to have an obvious implication on to way things look for the user.
No, absolutely. Well, prior to COVID, I was blogging about how I planned to take my little boy on public transport loads. So I've already got a barrier because I'm not brave enough to take a screaming toddler on public transport, let alone a screaming toddler during COVID who wants to run up and down a bus. So no, I haven't used bus or train since lockdown.
Glenn?
Absolutely same for me. As you'll know, Jenny, I was a late developer in terms of evangelizing about walking and walking as a service, the missing golden ingredient in mobility as a service. And pre-lockdown, I was absolutely thriving on particularly business travel where the walking was at either end of the public transport. But I've spent 6 months entirely living local and acting global with a few guilty trips to the supermarket by car.
Fantastic. Rona's put in the chat that in Bavaria she's using public transport lots. So it'd be interesting to see your experiences, Rona, if you want to put them in the chat. But I was going to ask Louise, sticking to Kate's question there. I know Kate quite well, as like many of you do. She lives rurally, like I live rurally. And to be fair, the trips we do at the moment are literally by car to the supermarket. And as she said, I need to make, without leaving me feeling out for too long, because she's feeling left out and exclusion and mental health. Is that an angle that maybe some of your surveys are going to look at? Is the implications on people's mental health of not being integrated into society and using the normal modes of transport?
Yeah, I mean, we do have communities of ex-public transport users and people who have been using throughout, and we are asking them about that kind of thing and the other impacts that the new way of living is having on their lives. And you know, this fear that is developing of going back into doing things that you used to do without even thinking about it, I think is a real issue across both public transport but also other areas of life. People just are, I think, you know, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme was an example of almost trying to get people to feel comfortable doing things that in the past they didn't even give it a second thought doing. But we haven't specifically looked at the kind of mental health side of things, but it is something we can ask our community about, and we're sort of open to suggestions of things that people, you, other stakeholders, everybody wants to know from transport users right now. So do send ideas to me.
Beth, Glenn, do you want to come in on anything?
I'm busy reading George's question, actually.
Well, I was actually going to move to George's question, if I may. I'm going to put this to you all. He says, the thing that makes MaaS difference is that it's a bottom up, and I'm a complete champion of that. And it's about co-designing, which I'd also champion as well, with the user, drilling down to actually understand needs and values. So what he's wanting to know is how, obviously, this opens up personalisation and incentivication. So in his viewpoint, Glenn, it's something new for the transport planner. He would probably disagree that it's something, you would say it's old, I would say it's old, but he's arguing it's something new for the transport planner. So he says, Beth, you're on the money. Do you agree? So should it be a bottom-up approach? Yeah. Should it be about co-designing? And is this new because it's about personalisation and incentivication? And if I've got it wrong, George, then please add into the chat. Nudging behaviour. Glenn.
I think, I mean, first of all, on nudge, and forgive me, but as the pale male stale on the panel, whenever someone says nudge, it takes me to Schiphol Airport men's urinals, where there's a blowfly which nudges my behaviour because I can't help but try and hit the target. But what we know about nudging is that it's not the panacea. It still is in the context of a more structural set of travel choices. So yes, of course, it has an important role to play, but we have to recognise its limitations. I mean, I would agree with George, but I think good mobility as a service development is just as good traveller information service development would have been years ago before we were talking MaaS. Of course, the great examples like Navigogo, which we've had mentioned from Beth, really illuminates excellent co-design, but that's partly because it's tailored to a particular community. Whereas, of course, and I was pleased to see Damien pick up on the little image of Transport Direct, Halcyon Days. Well, there, of course, you were dealing with a national system where you're trying to personalize it for the whole population, which becomes a bigger challenge, not one that should shy away from user engagement. And we didn't, in fact, we did, to add to Beth's methodologies, we did a lot of think aloud testing, particularly on usability with the design of Transport Direct all those years ago. But I do agree the capabilities we've got now to personalize are immeasurably improved compared to all those years ago.
Louise, Beth?
Building on that, really, I think at the individual level, quite a lot of people have been experimenting with how they make journeys, and when they need to go to places, they've been modifying their behaviour and looking at different ways of doing things. So whether that is to actively avoid a mode of transport that they don't feel particularly comfortable using anymore, or be encouraged to walk and cycle more. I mean, even neighbourhoods are changing sometimes in terms of, managing traffic and allowing more space for people to walk and do social distancing and all of that kind of thing. So I think many people have developed how they made journeys and started to consider more of a kind of multimodal, slotting things together to avoid perhaps using a particularly busy station or whatever it is. But equally, we know that many people have gone the other way and reverted to using private transport to make the journeys that they absolutely had to. So I think in many ways people are kind of almost making their own versions up of ways to get to places that they feel comfortable doing. So it's all quite interesting.
Beth, anything?
Yeah, I was just going to come back on that point about co-design, looking at individual needs or these groups of people and their needs. But I do think there are ways to engage within a project broader groups of people and really uncover where the commonalities are, where the differences are. And I do think that's why technology is enabling personalisation within a single service, personalisation within that service. And there's different ways to approach that when designing mobility as a service.
You've actually just started to address Stephen's question, which is obviously, from my perspective, I'm undertaking all my research next year for the PhD, and co-design is going to have to be online. And the point he's making is obviously if everything's going to be digitally at the moment, how do we reach those users? And we all know this. How do we reach those users that don't have access to internet or are not capable of engaging on one of the Miro boards or whatever there is out there? How do we actually do that and we don't fall into a trap?
Yeah, I'm a bit disappointed I didn't answer that better in my presentation, actually. So yeah, I'll reflect on that. But absolutely, it's important, and in some ways, that's the power of being able to run sessions where you can do that face to face and support people a little bit more. Or, for instance, we did a lot of the dementia work. We did those sessions where people were already meeting. We went to the dementia centre up in Aberdeen that was a sort of safe space where people already met, and so we can take co-design to them. And that's much harder when you're relying on digital tools. But there's 2 points. I think you still can support people to use digital tools, and in Scotland there's obviously the big push around supporting more people to be digitally enabled so that they can access all sorts of other digital services. So actually, can we see running a co-design workshop, and can we actually use it to bring about a bigger benefit of enabling more people to or training more people to be online? So is there a bigger opportunity there? But then yeah, my point about being creative about how we co-design. So that idea I mentioned of the kit that gets posted out in my idea of the research with new families. Well, maybe that kit isn't discussed on Zoom afterwards. Maybe it's just posted back to me with the activities done. Maybe I pick up the phone and have a call with somebody. Maybe I go and sit in their back garden 2 meters distance and talk through some of it with them. So absolutely, we need to be creative. That's what I loved in part about Dementia Diaries. These devices that they record their diary entries on are really simplified. They have been specially designed so people with dementia find them easy to use, and then volunteers are transcribing them. So it's, although it sounds a techie solution, it's actually really sort of low-key tech and enabling all sorts of people to contribute in that way. So yeah, we can do it. We need to do it. We should be doing it, and really thinking about how it isn't an exclusive process.
It's the thinking out the box, with no pun intended. And Louise, obviously, you're obviously trying to reach those people as well. Any thoughts on how you're going to go about it?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is. It's one of the reasons why pre-COVID we were always very keen on finding people when they were making the journey. So the National Rail Passenger Survey and the Bus Passenger Survey, you find people as they're making the journey or about to make the journey, so they can do it on paper. They don't have to be digitally engaged to do it. COVID is, of course, having a big temporary impact on the methods we can use to get data from people, and where we would have run focus groups, we're now having to do them online. But it is really important that you get the views from people who aren't in the main demographic groups, so that you do fully appreciate the things that other people have to offer. And whether that's because the situation that they're in makes them different, it's important to understand that. But equally, there's lots of additional insights that you can get from minority groups, and we have to think about making sure they are fully represented. It's a real challenge in research, and there is always this push to cheaper, quicker, digital, but we have to push back a bit and say that there are instances where you have to go to an old people centre, or you have to go into a school environment to speak to people from a whole range of backgrounds.
Yeah. Glenn, do you want to add to that?
Just to endorse what's been said, but I think perhaps partly to say, I think the glass is also half full, in that we weren't necessarily very good, and your poll may have illuminated that at the beginning, we're necessarily very good before COVID at the extent of engagement and diversity of user needs coverage. And I do think, whilst of course, as people have said, we need to reach out to those who are digitally excluded, those who are digitally included, the types of examples that Beth gave in her presentation, I'm certainly discovering are a fantastic way of opening out and possibly reaching more users. And indeed, the prospect of a blended approach where we start to use these digital tools when we are going out to that person's garden or to the community hall, because the old post-its falling off the wall, it's wonderful actually how you can use a Miro board to assemble it in real time.
You want to see my background of sticky notes on here, but just using those themes of asking the audience and digital research. Kate actually has a question for the audience that's here. Are those, so if you can put the answer in the chat, that'd be really great, rather than the Q&A. Are those of you that are involved in designing or running a business enrolling MaaS platforms out? Are you still pursuing the ambition for users to adopt a subscription model? So if that's a yes, no, can you put that into the chat, please? And Steve Cassidy's been quick to it and he said no.
Okay, Steve,
and what challenges are they facing in making the cost of different modes more easily comparable for the travelling users? So open to the audience to start the chat in there, and Kate's probably using this as a bit of research as well. So the panelists can answer that. Is subscription models the way forward? Yes or no? Quick, that's all you need to say, yes or no.
No.
So.
I wouldn't subscribe. How do I know next week exactly what mobility I need? That's what I struggle with. But do I know next week I need 5 taxis and 20 hours of car club? Not really. I don't know what I'm doing next week.
Louise, yes, no?
Totally no.
Glenn?
It's a no from me. I'm down at food and shelter rather than self-actualization.
I'm a no on this as well.
Yeah.
And I got asked the other day, would I share my data with somebody to get a MaaS service? And I said no, and they were all quite surprised at that. I wouldn't share my data. So it's, you need to understand your users. But Tom's put down yes for subscription models. So you're in contrast to us, Tom. So you can please expand on that. Be interesting to know. Building on this, Steve obviously has a lot of experience, Steve Cassidy that is, of Fuse Mobility, a lot of experience in the co-design and user engagement side of things. And he quite rightly puts the point, how do we actually bring all the learnings that we've got together from all these different projects or pilots or theories or viewpoints, whether it's just in Scotland or whether it's overseas, together into one place? How do we go about doing that?
Yeah, I think that's really important, and probably something that with the MaaS investment fund, it'd be brilliant to see that all projects had sort of equal access to best practice and could draw on expertise that's already there. I don't quite know how we do it.
Yeah, I fully support the sentiment of what Steve's getting at. And I know, again, sorry to hark back many years, but I remember with a colleague of mine, Susan Kenyon, we put together a best practice guide for designing public transport websites in the heady days of the beginning of the web. And what we focused on there was combining examples of good practice and not so good practice. And I think what's really important is fostering a confidence to be able to share what didn't work, what didn't go so well, rather than this temptation to try and appear that we're the best consultant, come to us next time because we never get anything wrong. I think the community has to feel that they can start to pull those lessons learned, good and bad.
I'm probably going to dump Ali in it, but maybe it's something that MaaS Scotland could look at doing as hosting, or maybe something that Carla Innovate UK could help, because it's the same in rural transport. Everybody's trying to regurgitate the same thing and look at things and get, as Glenn says, consultants in to do the same work they did 20 years ago. So how can we actually focus this down, share the practices, the good, the bad and the ugly, and then we can learn from it, particularly when we've got a MaaS investment fund coming on. Now, I'm conscious we're about to run out of time, but Beth, quickly, if you want to interrupt me, go for it.
All I was going to say is I think the bigger challenge is that the organisations and businesses creating the MaaS solutions who are already interested in user engagement will go and seek out tools and information like that. So to me, the bigger challenge is how do we get everybody to be looking at that and everybody to be using those tools rather than just those who are already interested.
And I'm not ignoring Alex's question there, but we can come, I'm sure it'll get discussed tomorrow as well about the economic impact on COVID on travel. But just before we summarise and I head back up to Ali, because it's nearly 5 o'clock and we all need a cup of tea, if not something stronger. Amy's got a poll here for those of you that haven't already guessed what type of poll it's going to be. But after participating in today's session, have we done a good enough job to help you consider the fact that you might use some formal user engagement in a future project, whether that's MaaS investment or not? So no pressure, people, that you're there, but 100% would be a really good result. Really good result. Beth's got her fingers crossed. So please, all of you, whether you've done it before or not, please do click yes or no, because this is really interesting. And as Ali said, user engagement often gets neglected. And for me, there's things to do with societal goals and all of this as well. And we often look at technology ready levels, but actually, is society ready for what we're proposing, and can people actually integrate with it and be involved in it? So as Glenn knows, I've got a PhD, it's got another 4 years to go, so I'm going to be talking about user engagement for a long time, along with Louise and Beth as well. So you've had 4 experts entertaining you for the last hour and a half, and I'm sure everybody will be quite happy to have their brains picked. But I'm passing back to Ali, and Amy can put up the results of the poll. Yay!
Hey!
We finish on a good note. Thank you. Even if you had a slight doubt and you ticked yes, thank you very much. Over to you, Ali.
That is what you call a result. That the session has clearly done its job. So thank you all to our panelists for engaging today, and of course for Jenny, as always, for sharing so ably, as I say, she always does. To Steve's point, and to build on what Jenny said around sharing of best practice in user engagement or any other area for that matter, really, I think you're absolutely right to highlight the MaaS Investment Fund and the MaaS programme, and I highlight and emphasise the word programme there as a perfect opportunity to do that. We should be looking at running these projects not as individual bubbles, but as a cohesive programme of individual activities that will build towards what we hope, of course, will be the greater rollout of mobility as a service. I think there is also, in fact, there is also a role for MaaS Scotland in this as well. And I think that's something that we can explore along with some of the other technical areas that we're looking at, areas that we're looking at across these next few days, where we could look to perhaps bring something a bit more cohesive to that. But for the moment, that just about is the end of this session.